It's been a long road. 13 years from Houston to Memphis to Nashville, now in Baltimore. It's been a long road. But, I've been fortunate. I've been fortunate to surround myself with great people, great coaches, great teammates, great family. And when you have that support, you can almost overcome everything in life.
Found dead in 2009. 10 years later, questions about evidence and motive still spark debate. On July 4th, the city of Nashville awoke to devastating news. Steve McNair, one of the NFL's most celebrated quarterbacks, was discovered shot to death inside a downtown condo. Beside him lay Sahel, Jenny Kazemi, a young woman who had become deeply entangled in his private life. Police would declare it a murder-suicide, closing the case in just a matter of days. But even with the evidence in plain sight, doubts lingered, and the shadows surrounding this tragedy never truly faded. To understand this tragedy, we must first step back into the lives of those at its center. Steve McNair was born in 1973 in Mount Olive, Mississippi. Raised in a modest household, he grew up with the grit and determination that would later define his football career. At Alcorn State University, he shattered records and earned national recognition, becoming one of the most dynamic quarterbacks college football had ever seen. By 1995, he was the third overall pick in the NFL draft, chosen by the Houston Oilers. Over the years, McNair built a reputation not just as a fierce competitor but as a leader who carried the Tennessee Titans to the brink of Super Bowl victory in 2000. Off the field, he was seen as a family man, a father of four, and a philanthropist deeply connected to his community. But his private life was more complicated.
This is when he got inducted into the Mississippi Hall of Fame. I always tell the young children, I say, I'm not bragging on him, but you can do what Steve McNair did. Just stay focused and move on up.
In 2008, McNair met Sahel, Jenny Kazemi, a 19-year-old waitress working in Nashville. Jenny's story was marked by hardship. Born in Florida to Iranian parents, her childhood was scarred by tragedy. Her father was murdered when she was only a child. Not long after, her mother lost a battle with cancer. Orphaned and searching for stability, Jenny moved to Tennessee with relatives. She left school early, working long shifts to make ends meet, but always seemed to be chasing something more. The connection between McNair and Kazemi quickly escalated into an affair. To Jenny's friends, it appeared she had found comfort in the attention of a famous athlete. McNair bought her a car, took her on trips, and provided a sense of security she had long craved. Yet beneath the surface, the relationship carried the weight of secrecy, dependency, and unspoken tension that would later prove explosive. The events of July 4, 2009, were pieced together through forensic detail and investigative records. Inside the condominium, Steve McNair's body was found slumped on the couch, struck by 4 gunshots. 2 bullets entered his chest, one pierced his right temple, and another his body from close range. He showed no signs of struggle. Just feet away, Sahel Kazemi lay lifeless on the floor, a single gunshot wound to her head. Underneath her body, investigators discovered the semi-automatic pistol that had ended both of their lives. From a behavioral standpoint, the crime scene revealed a sudden eruption rather than a carefully staged act. McNair was shot while sleeping, suggesting he never had the chance to defend himself. The absence of cleanup or concealment, and the placement of the weapon beneath Kazemi, pointed to an impulsive, emotionally charged decision rather than a calculated plot. Kazemi's awareness of risk appeared low. The shooting happened in a private condo she knew McNair often used, in the middle of a holiday weekend, with no thought of escape. Every sign indicated this was not a crime intended to remain hidden. Instead, it was a confrontation that ended in self-destruction. In the days before the tragedy, Kazemi's communication patterns added context. Text messages revealed mounting financial stress, suspicions of McNair's infidelity, and fears that he was pulling away from her. Friends described her as increasingly distraught, overwhelmed by bills, and desperate for reassurance. In behavioral analysis, these messages painted a portrait of escalating instability. Taken together, the scene suggested an unorganized act of violence fueled by emotional crisis. The details reflected not a long-planned crime, but an impulsive choice made in the shadow of jealousy, fear, and despair, an act where the outcome seemed inevitable the moment the trigger was pulled. When investigators reconstructed the days leading to the shooting, they found a chain of pressures pressing down on Sahel Kazemi. Financial strain was at the center. She was behind on rent, her car was on the verge of repossession, and her job barely covered her expenses. To her, Steve McNair had become not only a romantic partner, but also a lifeline. But cracks had begun to show. Just days before the tragedy, Kazemi was arrested for driving under the influence, with McNair as a passenger in the car. The incident embarrassed her and highlighted the imbalance in their relationship. To those close to her, she began voicing fears that McNair was seeing other women and preparing to abandon her. These stressors acted as the fuel, but the spark was her distorted belief that she was losing everything at once. In psychological terms, this reflected a cognitive distortion, an all-or-nothing mindset where the relationship became her only anchor, and its potential loss felt catastrophic. The act of violence carried no signs of material gain. There was no financial benefit, no calculated revenge. Instead, it reflected a desperate attempt to resolve unbearable emotional turmoil, an explosion of fear, jealousy, and despair that left no path for survival. Official findings from the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department were direct: the case was a murder-suicide. Investigators cited gunpowder residue on Sahel Kazemi's hand, fingerprints on the weapon, and her recent purchase of the firearm as key indicators. To police, the evidence was consistent, and the conclusion was swift. No formal psychiatric diagnosis was ever recorded for Kazemi, but her history spoke volumes. Childhood trauma, repeated losses, and financial instability placed her in a high-risk category for emotional crisis. Independent experts reviewing the case later noted that her behavior aligned with patterns seen in dependent personality structures, where fear of abandonment can escalate into dangerous extremes. Law enforcement profilers emphasized the immediacy of the act. It was not planned over months but triggered by stress and jealousy in the final days of her life. In their assessment, the tragedy was the product of desperation, not conspiracy. When viewed alongside other intimate partner murder-suicides, the McNair case followed recognizable patterns. Experts note that such tragedies often stem from sudden emotional escalation, a mix of dependency, jealousy, and fear of abandonment. The act is typically impulsive, carried out in a private setting, and resolved with the offender taking their own life. Yet, there were features that made this case stand out. The stark age difference between Steve McNair and Sahel Kazemi, combined with the imbalance of power, wealth, and status, created unusual dynamics. Unlike many cases where the perpetrator is older and more dominant, here the younger, financially dependent partner initiated the fatal act. The high-profile nature of the victim also distinguished this tragedy. McNair was a public figure, beloved by fans, which brought extraordinary attention and scrutiny. In this sense, the case confirmed well-documented behavioral patterns, but under circumstances that few had anticipated. Steve McNair was 36 years old at the time of his death. Known as Air McNair, he was celebrated for his toughness and ability to play through injuries. Over a 13-year NFL career, he earned 3 Pro Bowl selections and became the first African-American quarterback to win the league's co-MVP award in 2003. Beyond the field, he invested in restaurants, youth programs, and charities across Nashville. Friends and family described him as a man who valued loyalty, someone who carried his Mississippi roots with pride. For his 4 sons, he was more than an athlete, he was a father who attended games, practices, and school events whenever his schedule allowed. Sahel Jenny Kazemi was only 20. Those who knew her remembered a young woman who carried both kindness and scars. After losing her parents, she worked tirelessly to provide for herself, often holding multiple jobs. Co-workers described her as cheerful with customers, but friends noticed the heavy weight of her financial struggles. In her relationship with McNair, she sought stability and belonging. To many, she was seen as fragile, caught between the hardships of her past and the hopes she had pinned on the future. Both lives, though worlds apart, collided in a way that ended in irreversible loss. News of Steve McNair's death spread like wildfire across Nashville on that July 4th weekend. Fans who once cheered him under stadium lights now gathered outside his condominium, stunned into silence. The image of a beloved quarterback, one who had carried the Tennessee Titans to within a yard of Super Bowl victory, was now tied to an unthinkable tragedy. Police cars and media vans filled the street, while reporters struggled to explain how a man admired for his leadership could meet such a violent end. The NFL community reeled. Former teammates spoke of disbelief, unable to reconcile the memory of McNair's toughness on the field with the vulnerability of his final hours. For the Titans organization, it was not just the loss of a former star but the loss of a man who had given the city its proudest football moment. For McNair's family, the devastation was even sharper. His wife and children were forced to grieve under the harsh glare of national media, their private sorrow dissected by strangers. The suddenness of the event left no time for answers, only questions. How could a trusted relationship unravel into such violence, and what had really happened inside that quiet condo? When investigators entered Steve McNair's condominium, they were met with a scene that suggested sudden violence. McNair's body was discovered slumped on a sofa, with multiple gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest and 1 to the head. Just a few feet away lay Sahel Kazemi, dead from a single gunshot wound to the temple. A semi-automatic pistol rested beside her body. The first task for detectives was to determine whether this was a double homicide or a murder-suicide. Forensic teams carefully documented the positions of the bodies, the weapon, and spent shell casings. They noted there were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked belongings, and no evidence of a third party inside the condo. The strongest clue came from gunshot residue tests. Residue was found on Kazemi's hand, consistent with her firing the weapon. Ballistic analysis confirmed all rounds had been fired from the same gun, the pistol found at her side. Investigators also traced the firearm back to a recent purchase made by Kazemi. According to records, she had bought it just days earlier, raising questions about her state of mind in the lead-up to the shooting. Toxicology results added further detail. McNair's blood showed no signs of drugs, only traces of alcohol. Kazemi's tests, however, revealed both alcohol and an anti-anxiety medication in her system at the time of death. Detectives considered the combination a potential factor in her judgment. While the physical evidence strongly supported the conclusion of murder-suicide, it did not explain why it happened. That answer, investigators believed, might be found not in the crime scene, but in the unraveling relationship between McNair and Kazemi in the days before July 4th. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the picture of Steve McNair and Sahel Kazemi's relationship grew darker. Publicly, McNair was a beloved figure, a retired NFL star, a family man with a wife and 4 children. Privately, he was living a double life. Kazemi, just 20 years old, had been working as a waitress when she met McNair. To her, the relationship felt serious, even destined. She believed he would eventually leave his marriage to build a future with her. But cracks began to form. Friends later told police that Kazemi felt overwhelmed. She had recently been pulled over for driving under the influence, and during that traffic stop, she confided to the officer that her life was all messed up. Around the same time, she discovered McNair was seeing other women, leaving her feeling betrayed and insecure. Financial stress only deepened the tension. Kazemi had purchased a Cadillac she couldn't afford, and McNair had been helping her with payments. As pressure mounted, those close to her noticed sharp mood swings. Some described her as frightened of losing McNair, while others recalled her speaking with anger about his lack of commitment. The most telling sign came just 2 days before the shooting, when Kazemi purchased a gun. She told friends it was for personal protection, but investigators would later argue that the purchase signaled growing desperation. Detectives pieced together a troubling portrait, a young woman caught between hope and heartbreak, clinging to a man who never intended to give her what she wanted. When those illusions shattered, the motive for violence emerged. Police concluded that jealousy, fear of abandonment, and emotional instability created a volatile mix, one that reached its breaking point on July 4, 2009. The shock of Steve McNair's death rippled far beyond Nashville. Within hours of the discovery, national news outlets broke into holiday programming to cover the story. For many Americans, the headline was almost impossible to believe: an NFL icon, gunned down in his prime. Reporters camped outside the condominium, while helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting images of the crime scene into living rooms across the country. In Nashville, the grief was immediate and raw. Fans gathered outside LP Field, now Nissan Stadium, leaving flowers, jerseys, and handwritten notes at the base of the statue that commemorated McNair's contribution to the Titans. The city had long claimed him as one of its own, and the suddenness of his death felt like a wound to the community's identity. Radio stations filled with callers sharing memories of McNair's grit and determination, while local pastors held vigils to help a grieving public find peace. The media, however, took a different tone. Coverage quickly shifted from mourning to scrutinizing McNair's personal life. Headlines highlighted the affair, the age difference, and the tragic decision-making that placed him in Kazemi's orbit. For McNair's widow, Michelle, this added layer of exposure was devastating. She was forced to balance the grief of losing her husband with the humiliation of having his private choices debated on national television. At the same time, some commentators questioned the framing of Kazemi as merely the mistress. Supporters pointed out that she, too, had a family, dreams, and struggles that deserved acknowledgement. This tension between sympathy and condemnation played out in endless opinion pieces, further fueling public debate. The story was no longer just about a violent death, it had become a national conversation about fame, secrecy, and the destructive power of broken relationships. In the years after Steve McNair's death, the shadows of that July 4th weekend lingered. For his family, the tragedy never truly faded. His 4 sons grew up without their father, navigating both the pain of his absence and the public scrutiny that surrounded his name. Michelle McNair, his widow, carried the burden of grief while protecting her children from a narrative that often focused more on scandal than on Steve's life as a father. For the Tennessee Titans and the NFL community, McNair's legacy became a delicate balance. On the field, he was remembered as one of the toughest quarterbacks of his era, a man who played through injuries and nearly carried his team to a championship. Fans continued to honor his achievements, holding memorials and wearing his number in tribute. Yet off the field, his story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how personal decisions can ripple outward in devastating ways. Kazemi's family, too, was left with scars. Her death at just 20 years old raised painful questions about youth, vulnerability, and the consequences of unchecked emotional turmoil. For them, she was not defined by her final act, but remembered as a sister, a daughter, and a young woman whose life ended before it could fully begin. The legacy of this case endures, equal parts triumph and tragedy. From the very beginning, the way Steve McNair's death was covered raised difficult ethical questions. The intensity of media attention often blurred the line between informing the public and exploiting private grief. Reporters rushed to reveal details of McNair's affair, sometimes with little regard for the impact on his wife, Michelle, and their children. What should have been a space for mourning became a spectacle, with his personal choices dissected in front of a national audience. The coverage of Sahel Kazemi also revealed troubling biases. Much of the media reduced her to the role of mistress, overshadowing her humanity and struggles. Few outlets explored her youth, her financial difficulties, or the mental health pressures that may have shaped her decisions. Instead, her story was often framed as a cautionary tale of obsession, leaving little room for empathy. Families on both sides expressed discomfort with how quickly the tragedy was transformed into entertainment. The ethical responsibility of telling such stories lies in balancing public interest with respect for the dignity of those left behind. In this case, that balance was often lost. McNair's death remains not just a crime story, but a reminder of the media's power to shape memory, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with harm. The investigation into Steve McNair's death moved quickly, but it was not without complications. Detectives entered a crime scene that was both shocking and delicate. McNair had been shot 4 times, while Sahel Kazemi lay nearby with a single gunshot wound to the head. The placement of the bodies, the position of the firearm, and the blood patterns all seemed to indicate a murder-suicide. Yet the high-profile nature of the case meant every detail would be scrutinized. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence was the gunpowder residue found on Kazemi's hand, which supported the theory that she fired the weapon. But this evidence alone was not enough. Investigators had to reconstruct the timeline leading up to the tragedy. Witness statements revealed Kazemi's purchase of the handgun just days before the shooting, though questions lingered about how a 20-year-old had been able to buy the weapon so easily. Some obstacles came from public perception. Rumors spread quickly, with speculation about other possible suspects or conspiracies. Police faced immense pressure to deliver clear answers, knowing that any hint of uncertainty could fuel doubt. There were also challenges in balancing transparency with privacy. Detectives released enough information to support their findings, but not all details were made public, frustrating some who questioned the official conclusion. Ultimately, the Nashville police ruled the case a murder-suicide, citing forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the absence of signs pointing to another perpetrator. Still, the process revealed how even straightforward findings can become tangled under the weight of public expectation and the unique difficulties of investigating the death of a celebrity. The resolution of Steve McNair's case came swiftly compared to many high-profile investigations. Within days, Nashville police announced their conclusion: Sahel Kazemi had murdered McNair before turning the gun on herself. The determination rested on several key factors: the forensic match between Kazemi and the weapon she had purchased days earlier, the gunpowder residue on her hand, and the absence of forced entry or signs of another assailant. Witness accounts of her distress in the days leading up to July 4 further reinforced the narrative of a young woman unraveling under the weight of betrayal and fear of abandonment. But the speed of resolution also carried lessons. Some critics argued that the investigation's efficiency left unanswered questions, fueling conspiracy theories and mistrust. Others noted how little attention was given to Kazemi's mental health, her vulnerability, and the systemic failures, like the ease of her firearm purchase, that played a role in the tragedy. For law enforcement, the case became an example of how media scrutiny and public expectation can intensify pressure on an investigation. For communities, it served as a sobering reminder that fame and success do not shield individuals from hidden turmoil. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what was lost. Steve McNair's death cut short a life of talent, leadership, and promise, while Sahel Kazemi's actions ended her own before it had fully begun. Their story underscores the importance of looking deeper into private struggles, where intervention might prevent violence before it's too late. On July 4, 2009, 2 lives ended inside a Nashville condominium, but the echoes of that night continue to be felt. Steve McNair, remembered as a warrior on the football field, a leader who carried his team to glory, became instead a symbol of how private choices can collide with devastating consequences. Sahel Kazemi, only 20 years old, left behind a family still struggling to reconcile the daughter they loved with the violent act she committed. For the community, the story remains a cautionary tale. It is about fame and vulnerability, about how hidden pain can turn into tragedy when left unaddressed. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Could anyone have seen the warning signs? Could intervention have changed the ending? Or was this a collision of circumstances destined to spiral beyond control? In the years since, fans still speak McNair's name with reverence, recalling his toughness and heart. His legacy lives in highlight reels, in the memories of those unforgettable Sundays, and in the city he helped put on the football map. Yet alongside that legacy sits a quiet reminder that even the strongest heroes can have fragile lives, and that tragedy often comes when least expected.